But just as despair began to settle in, a miracle happened. The raccoon gasped. A sudden, sharp breath that made both John and Mary jump. Its chest rose again, shaky but determined. Its eyes flickered with life, not just reflex. It was fighting. Somehow, against all odds, it was fighting. An unexpected encounter. The early morning sun stretched its golden fingers across the quiet town, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks and weathered picket fences. The air was crisp, filled with the faint scent of dew-soaked grass and distant wood smoke. It was the kind of morning that wrapped itself around you like an old, familiar quilt, comforting, predictable, and peaceful. John adjusted his worn cowboy hat against the slant of light as he and Mary strolled down the narrow path that wound through Maplewood Park. Their footsteps crunched softly against the gravel, the rhythm steady and familiar, like the heartbeat of their shared life. Mary carried a small wicker basket, the handle smooth from years of use, filled with crumbs to scatter for the park's resident ducks. A ritual that had become part of their morning routine. "Looks like the geese have claimed the pond again," Mary remarked with a soft chuckle, nodding toward the water where a gang of honking birds lorded over the space, chasing away any duck foolish enough to come too close. John grunted, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Territorial little buggers, aren't they?" Mary smiled, her face framed by soft gray curls that danced in the morning breeze. Despite the lines etched by time around her eyes and mouth, there was a warmth in her gaze, a light that had never dimmed through the years. She reached into the basket and scattered a handful of crumbs, watching as the braver ducks waddled closer, cautious but hopeful. But it wasn't the ducks that caught John's attention. Something off in the distance, near the tree line where the park met a patch of wild undergrowth, seemed out of place. A small, crumpled figure half hidden by fallen leaves and shadow. At first, he thought it might be a discarded piece of clothing, maybe an old jacket someone had lost. But then it moved, just slightly, a faint twitch that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. "Mary," he said quietly, his tone shifting from casual to concerned. She followed his gaze, squinting against the morning sun. Without another word, they veered off the path, their steps quickening as they approached the motionless form. It wasn't until they were almost on top of it that they realized what it was. A raccoon, but not like the ones they'd often seen rummaging through trash cans or darting across country roads at night. This one was different. Its fur, usually sleek and thick, was matted and dirty, clumped with dried blood and bits of debris. Deep scratches marred its sides, and one of its front paws was twisted at an unnatural angle. The animal's chest rose and fell with labored, shallow breaths, its sides trembling with the effort. Dull, glassy eyes cracked open as they approached, reflecting not fear, but something worse: resignation. "Oh, you poor thing," Mary whispered, her heart tightening at the sight. She instinctively reached out, but John gently caught her wrist. "Careful," he murmured. "Might be hurt bad, could lash out." But the raccoon made no attempt to move, no sign of aggression. It just lay there, breathing raggedly, too weak to care about the humans looming over it. For a brief moment, they stood there, suspended in silence except for the distant honking of geese and the rustle of wind through the trees. John's practical side, the part of him shaped by years of farm life, of understanding the harsh, unforgiving nature of the world, wanted to walk away. It was just a wild animal, after all. Nature would take its course. But then he glanced at Mary. Her eyes, soft yet fierce with compassion, told him everything. He'd seen that look before, when she'd nursed a sick calf back to health during a brutal winter, when she'd stayed up all night with an orphaned duckling cradled in her hands. That look always meant one thing: they weren't leaving without that raccoon. John sighed, tugging off his jacket. "Well," he muttered, crouching down carefully, "let's see if we can't give you a fighting chance." The raccoon didn't resist as John gently wrapped it in the jacket. Its body was alarmingly light, all bones and fragile breath. John could feel the faint, uneven heartbeat through the thin fabric, a weak thrum against his calloused hands. Mary hovered close, her fingers brushing the raccoon's head softly. "We'll take you home," she whispered, as if the animal could understand. "You're safe now." The walk back to the truck was quiet. The weight of the raccoon, both literal and emotional, pressed heavily between them. Mary cradled the bundle in her lap as John drove. His jaw set, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every so often as if checking for something he couldn't quite name. When they arrived at the farm, the familiar sight of their modest house and sprawling fields didn't bring the usual comfort. Everything felt different now, charged with urgency. Inside, they cleared the old wooden kitchen table, laying the raccoon down gently. The afternoon light streamed through the curtains, casting golden patches on the faded tablecloth. Mary gathered towels, warm water, and the small first aid kit they usually reserved for minor animal injuries on the farm. John cleaned the wounds with careful, practiced hands, though this was unlike tending to a cow's scratch or a chicken's injured leg. The raccoon's injuries were severe. Deep gashes along its ribs, likely from some kind of animal attack, and that mangled paw swollen and discolored. As they worked, the raccoon remained eerily still, its eyes half-lidded. Mary kept murmuring softly, words of comfort more for herself than the animal. Hours passed in a blur of makeshift bandages and whispered prayers. By evening, the raccoon was nestled in a small box lined with blankets near the warmth of the fireplace. Its breathing was still shallow but steady, a fragile thread they clung to. Exhausted, John sank into his old armchair, staring at the flickering flames. Mary sat cross-legged on the floor beside the box, her hand resting lightly on the blanket covering the small creature. "Do you think he'll make it?" she asked quietly, not looking up. John didn't answer right away. He watched the fire crackle, its warmth doing little to thaw the knot of worry in his chest. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we'll do everything we can." Mary nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "That's all we can do." And as the night wrapped around their small farmhouse, filled with the soft sounds of breathing, both human and fragilely animal, they knew that this unexpected encounter had already changed something. In their hearts, and perhaps in ways they couldn't yet understand. They had found a raccoon in the park. But maybe, just maybe, it was the raccoon who had found them. The fragile line between life and death. The morning light crept slowly into the small farmhouse, casting long golden streaks across the worn wooden floorboards. The air was thick with an uneasy stillness, broken only by the faint, labored breaths of the raccoon nestled in the makeshift bed near the fireplace. The warmth from the dying embers offered little comfort compared to the chill that settled in John and Mary's hearts. Mary had barely slept. She sat on the floor beside the raccoon, her back resting against the armchair, eyes red from exhaustion and worry. Her fingers lightly stroked the soft edge of the blanket wrapped around the fragile creature, as if the simple act of touch could tether it to life. The raccoon's chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven gasps, each breath a fragile thread threatening to snap. John stirred from the old armchair, stretching stiffly. His body ached from sleep lost and worry gained. He glanced at Mary, then at the raccoon, his face shadowed with the kind of fear he rarely showed. Not fear of the raccoon itself, but fear of loss. They'd saved countless animals on the farm, but this felt different. More personal, more fragile. "How is he?" John's voice was rough with sleep and emotion. Mary didn't look up. "The same. Maybe worse." John rose, his joints creaking in protest, and knelt beside her. The raccoon's eyes were half-lidded, unfocused, glazed with a dull sheen that spoke of pain and exhaustion. Its breathing rattled softly, like wind passing through brittle leaves. John gently placed his hand near its fragile body, not touching, just feeling for warmth, for life. "We should try to get some fluids in him," he said quietly, his mind flipping through memories of farm medicine, remedies they'd used for weak calves or sick lambs. But this wasn't a farm animal. This was something wild, delicate, and slipping away. Mary nodded, wiping her eyes. She stood slowly, her knees stiff, and fetched a small syringe from the kitchen drawer, one they'd used for feeding orphaned ducklings in the past. She filled it with a mixture of warm water and honey, hoping the sugar might give the raccoon a little strength. Kneeling back down, she gently touched the raccoon's mouth with the tip of the syringe. Its reaction was faint, A flicker of movement, a weak twitch of its whiskers. Carefully, Mary released a drop onto its tongue. The raccoon didn't swallow at first, but after a tense moment, its throat convulsed slightly, taking in the tiniest sip. John exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's it," Mary whispered softly. "Come on, little one. Just a bit more." They worked in shifts throughout the day, taking turns offering drops of the sweet liquid, checking the raccoon's breathing, adjusting the blankets to keep it warm. The hours blurred together, marked only by the slow progression of sunlight across the walls and the steady ticking of the old clock in the kitchen. By late afternoon, there was a small sign of hope. The raccoon shifted slightly in its blanket, a faint, almost imperceptible movement. Its breathing, though still ragged, seemed a little steadier. Its eyes opened just a sliver more, revealing a spark of awareness that hadn't been there before. Mary's heart leapt. "John, look, he's fighting." John crouched beside her, his rough hand covering hers. "Damn stubborn, aren't you?" he murmured to the raccoon, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. He knew they weren't out of the woods yet. That night, as darkness settled over the farm like a heavy blanket, John and Mary kept vigil. The farmhouse, usually filled with the comforting sounds of animals outside and the occasional creak of old wood, felt too quiet, the silence pressing in on them. At some point, John dozed off in his chair, but Mary stayed awake, her hand resting lightly on the raccoon's fragile body. She whispered stories into the dim glow of the fire, about their farm, their life together, and the animals they'd loved and lost. Maybe it was more for herself than for the raccoon, but it felt like she was holding space for both of them. Just before dawn, something changed. The raccoon's body tensed slightly, its breathing becoming erratic. Mary's heart clenched with fear. She gently shook John awake, her voice a whisper filled with panic. "John, something's wrong." John was on his feet in an instant, kneeling beside her. The raccoon's eyes were open wider now, but not with clarity, with fear. Its small body convulsed weakly, a soft whimper escaping its throat. Mary cradled it gently, her tears falling freely now. "Stay with me," she whispered desperately. "You're not alone. Just hold on." John reached for the syringe again, but the raccoon was too weak to respond. All they could do was hold on, literally and figuratively, hoping that somehow their presence could bridge the gap between life and death. Minutes felt like hours, and then the raccoon's breathing slowed. One breath, then another longer pause, another shallow gasp, and stillness. Mary let out a soft, broken sob, clutching the small body to her chest. John's hand rested on her shoulder, his grip firm but trembling. But just as despair began to settle in, a miracle happened. The raccoon gasped, a sudden, sharp breath that made both John and Mary jump. Its chest rose again, shaky but determined. Its eyes flickered with life, not just reflex. It was fighting. Somehow, against all odds, it was fighting. Mary laughed through her tears, holding the raccoon close but carefully. That's it, little one. You're not done yet." John sat back heavily, running a hand down his face. "Stubborn little thing," he muttered again. But this time his voice was thick with emotion. As the sun finally crept over the horizon, filling the room with soft light, hope filled the space between them. Fragile, tentative, but real. The line between life and death had been razor-thin. But for now, life had won. Small victories and new fears. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope stretched thin over an abyss. Every morning John and Mary woke with the same question hanging silently between them. Is he still alive? The raccoon's fragile existence became the fragile thread that connected their routines, their thoughts, and even their quiet moments. The raccoon, whom Mary had quietly started calling Shadow because of the dark ring markings around his weary eyes, was fighting. His breaths grew steadier, his eyes clearer, and though his body remained frail, there was a flicker of something defiant within him, a stubborn will to survive. Mary spent most of her days by Shadow's side, her gentle hands tending to his wounds with a tenderness that spoke of both care and quiet desperation. She cleaned his cuts with warm water, dabbing at them with soft cloths, whispering reassurances as though her words could stitch him back together. John, though less vocal, showed his care in his own quiet ways. He built a small wooden crate lined with old flannel blankets, turning it into a cozy nest where Shadow could rest safely. When Mary wasn't looking, John would pause beside the crate, his calloused fingers brushing lightly over Shadow's fragile form, as if grounding himself in the fact that the little creature was still breathing. One morning, as the soft glow of dawn spilled into the kitchen, Mary noticed a small but significant change. Shadow was trying to lift his head. "John," she called, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. John hurried in, wiping his hands on a towel, his brow furrowed until his eyes landed on Shadow. The raccoon's head wobbled slightly, his weak muscles struggling to support the weight, but it was a victory nonetheless. "Look at you," John whispered, kneeling beside the crate. His voice was soft, filled with cautious hope. "You're a tough little guy, aren't you?" Shadow's glassy eyes blinked slowly, his nose twitching faintly at the scent of the warm oatmeal Mary had prepared for breakfast. Encouraged, she dipped her finger into a small bowl of mashed banana mixed with honey and gently offered it to him. At first, he didn't react, but then, with a hesitant flick of his tongue, he tasted it. Mary gasped softly, her heart swelling. It was the smallest gesture, but to her, it felt like watching the first fragile leaf of spring after a long, bitter winter. Over the next few days, Shadow's strength grew bit by bit. He could lift his head for longer periods, his eyes followed movement with more awareness, and he even attempted to nibble on small pieces of soft fruit. His paw, though still swollen and misshapen, showed signs of healing under John's careful bandaging. But just as hope began to bloom, fear crept in like an unwelcome shadow. It was late one afternoon, the sky painted in streaks of orange and pink, when John suggested, "Maybe we should let him get some fresh air." Mary hesitated. The thought of Shadow outside, away from the warmth and safety of their home, made her heart race. But John had a point. Fresh air, sunlight, it could do him good. They carried Shadow outside in his crate, placing it gently on the porch where the warm breeze carried the scents of grass, earth, and distant wildflowers. Shadow perked up immediately, his nose twitching, his ears flicking toward the sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. But peace has a way of shattering when you least expect it. A sudden noise, a sharp bang from the road beyond the farm, the roar of an engine, startled Shadow. His instincts kicked in faster than his healing body could manage. In a blur of unexpected strength, he scrambled out of the crate, his injured paw dragging as he bolted toward the open gate that led to the dirt road. "Shadow!" Mary screamed, dropping everything as she sprinted after him. John's heart raced as he followed, his boots pounding against the ground. Time seemed to slow. The raccoon was fast, surprisingly fast, adrenaline fueling his desperate escape. But the sound that haunted John's ears was louder, the approaching rumble of a truck barreling down the road. Mary reached out, her fingers just grazing Shadow's fur as he darted onto the dusty path. The truck's horn blared. John's heart felt like it stopped. With a final burst of speed, John lunged, grabbing Mary around the waist and pulling her back just as the truck thundered past, missing Shadow by inches. Dust and gravel exploded into the air, a cloud of chaos and fear. When the dust settled, Mary broke free from John's grasp, falling to her knees on the side of the road, her eyes frantically searching. There, just a few feet away, was Shadow, frozen, his sides heaving, his small body trembling from the shock. He hadn't been hit. Mary crawled toward him, tears streaming down her face, whispering his name like a prayer. She scooped him into her arms, cradling him against her chest as though her heartbeat could steady his. John sank to his knees beside her, his breath ragged. "Damn fool," he muttered softly, though his hand trembled as he reached out to stroke Shadow's fur. The words weren't meant for the raccoon alone. Back in the house, they checked him over carefully. Miraculously, he hadn't reopened any wounds, though his breathing was shallow again, his fragile body overwhelmed by the stress. They bundled him in warm blankets, whispering soft reassurances. their hearts heavy with both relief and lingering fear. That night, as they sat by the fire, Shadow nestled safely between them. John broke the silence. "He doesn't belong in a crate," he said quietly. "He's wild, Mary. His heart's out there, not in here." Mary nodded slowly, her fingers running through Shadow's soft fur. "I know, but I'm not ready to lose him." John didn't respond, but his hand covered hers, warm and steady. In that quiet, flickering glow, they both understood the truth neither wanted to face. Saving Shadow wasn't just about healing his body. It was about preparing to let him go. But not yet. For now, they had another day, another small victory, and that was enough. The weight of letting go. The days following Shadow's near-death escape were marked by a fragile calm, as though the world itself was holding its breath alongside John and Mary. The farmhouse, usually filled with the comforting hum of daily chores, the clatter of buckets, the soft lowing of cows, the rustle of straw underfoot, felt quieter, as if the animals sensed the shift in their caretaker's hearts. Shadow had retreated into himself after the incident. He no longer displayed the small bursts of energy that had given John and Mary hope. Instead, he spent hours curled into a tight ball, his small body trembling occasionally as if reliving the terror of the truck's blaring horn and the roar of tires on gravel. His eyes, once flickering with newfound life, seemed distant again, shadowed by something deeper than physical pain. Mary watched him with a heart heavy as stone. She sat beside his crate for hours, her fingers gently stroking his fur, whispering soft words meant to soothe not just him, but herself. She'd poured her heart into saving him, stitching fragile threads of hope into every bandage, every drop of honey water, every sleepless night. But now those threads felt like they were unraveling. John, ever the practical one, kept busy. He mended fences, tended to the animals, chopped wood. Anything to keep his hands occupied and his mind from drifting back to the image of Shadow frozen on the road, inches from death. But no matter how hard he worked, the ache lingered. One evening, as the sky burned with the deep orange and purple hues of sunset, John found Mary sitting on the porch, her eyes distant, Shadow nestled quietly in her lap. The raccoon's breathing was steadier, but there was a heaviness in the way he lay, as if the very act of being alive was a weight he could barely carry. John lowered himself onto the steps beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sounds the distant rustle of leaves and the faint chirping of crickets waking for the night. "He's not getting better," Mary finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the gentle evening breeze. John didn't respond right away. He stared out at the horizon, his jaw clenched, the muscles in his face tight with unspoken emotion. Finally, he said quietly, "Maybe he's not meant to stay." Mary's fingers froze in Shadow's fur. "I can't. I don't know how to let him go." John's gaze softened. He reached over, covering her hand with his rough, calloused one. "We didn't find him to keep him, Mary. We found him to give him a chance. Maybe now. Maybe it's his turn to decide what to do with it." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. That night, they barely slept. Mary lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above their bed, while John sat in his old chair, watching over Shadow's small, fragile form. Morning crept in slowly, painting the room with pale light. It was Mary who spoke first. "Let's take him to the woods." John nodded silently. They packed a small basket with Shadow's favorite soft fruits, a blanket, and some water. Carefully, John lifted Shadow, wrapping him gently in the flannel he'd come to associate with comfort and safety. They walked in silence, side by side, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path leading toward the woods, the same woods where they'd first found him. The forest greeted them with the familiar sense of pine and earth, the soft chorus of birdsong filtering through the canopy above. They reached a small clearing, bathed in dappled sunlight, where the ground was soft with moss and the air smelled of wildflowers. Mary knelt, cradling Shadow in her arms one last time. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, there was recognition. A faint flicker of trust, of gratitude perhaps. She pressed her forehead gently against his, whispering, "You're strong enough now. It's okay." John helped her place Shadow gently on the mossy ground. The raccoon lay still for a long moment, his small body motionless as if he didn't understand what was happening. Then, slowly, he lifted his head, sniffing the air. His ears perked slightly, catching the distant rustle of the wild, the world he'd almost left behind. And then, with trembling limbs, he moved. It wasn't graceful. His steps were shaky, unsteady, but each movement carried more strength than the last. He paused at the edge of the clearing, looking back one final time. His dark eyes met Mary's, then John's, filled with something unspoken, something wild and free. And then he disappeared into the trees. Mary's tears came silently, but there was no pain in them this time, only a bittersweet relief. John wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They stood there for a long time, watching the place where Shadow had vanished, until the forest grew quiet again. As they walked back home, the weight in their hearts felt lighter, replaced by something warm, like the lingering glow of a fire long after the flames have died. They had saved him, and now he was free. The silence he left behind. The house felt emptier than John or Mary had expected. Not in the obvious way. Shadow had been small, barely taking up space compared to the clattering of pots, the lowing of cows, or the raucous honking of geese outside. But his absence was like a shadow itself, creeping into corners, lingering in the quiet moments between chores, filling the spaces where his soft breathing once was. Mary found herself pausing at the crate they'd left by the fireplace, her hand reaching out before stopping midair, fingers curling into a fist. The soft blanket was still there, the faint imprint of where Shadow used to lie barely visible. She left it untouched, unable to bring herself to fold it away. John felt it too, though he didn't say much. Instead, he threw himself into the farm work with a stubborn determination. He mended fences that didn't need mending, fixed the squeaky hinge on the barn door, and even spent an entire morning scrubbing the tractor clean until it gleamed in the sun. But no matter how much he did, the emptiness remained. One afternoon, Mary stood by the window, watching the tree line where Shadow had disappeared days before. She wondered if he was okay, if he'd found shelter, if he remembered them, or if wild instincts had washed away all traces of the fragile connection they'd shared. John came up behind her, resting his large, warm hand on her shoulder. "You thinking about him?" She nodded, her throat tight. "I thought it would feel better, knowing he's free." John didn't answer right away. Instead, he squeezed her shoulder gently, then said, "It's not the freedom that hurts. It's the loving." They stood like that for a while, wrapped in the comfortable silence that only comes with years of shared life, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. That evening, after the animals were fed and the last light of day faded into soft purples and blues, they sat on the porch with steaming mugs of tea. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Mary broke the silence first. "I keep thinking I'll see him again, like maybe he'll come back." John stared out into the dark, the brim of his old hat casting a shadow over his eyes. "Maybe he will, or maybe he won't. But either way, we were part of his story, and he's part of ours." Mary smiled faintly, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes but not falling. "I just miss him." "Me too," John admitted softly. The days stretched on, the ache dulling but never quite disappearing. Life on the farm had its own rhythm, one that didn't pause for grief or longing. The cows still needed milking, the chickens still scattered when fed, and the geese still hissed at John when he got too close. But then, something changed. It was early morning, the sky painted in pale streaks of pink and gold. Mary was gathering eggs in the chicken coop when she heard a sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable, a rustle in the bushes near the edge of the yard. Her heart raced as she set down the basket carefully and walked toward the noise, her breath catching in her throat. She told herself it was probably just a stray cat or a curious squirrel. But deep down, hope flickered like a fragile flame. Pushing aside the tall grass, she saw him, Shadow. Thinner, wilder, his fur a little rougher than before, but it was him. His dark eyes met hers, filled with recognition and something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't comfort either. He didn't approach, didn't come running like a pet would. He simply stood there, as if to say, "I remember." Mary knelt slowly, her heart pounding. "Hey there, little one," she whispered softly. Shadow blinked, his nose twitching, then took a cautious step forward, but only one. He didn't need more. The space between them was filled with something deeper than distance, understanding. John appeared behind her, silent as always, watching. His hand found hers, warm and steady. After a few moments, Shadow turned and disappeared into the trees once more. Mary let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she smiled. "He's okay," she whispered. John squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah, he's okay." And so were they, a fragile thread. After Shadow's brief return, life settled into a new rhythm. Not quite the same as before, but stitched together with threads of quiet acceptance and lingering hope. John and Mary went about their days with a renewed sense of purpose, though their hearts remained tethered to the wild woods beyond the farm, where a small raccoon had left paw prints not just in the dirt, but on their souls. The autumn air grew crisper, painting the landscape in hues of amber, crimson, and gold. The farm buzzed with preparations for the colder months ahead. John stacked firewood with methodical precision, the rhythmic thunk of the axe splitting logs echoing through the crisp morning air. Mary busied herself with canning jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, her kitchen filled with the sweet scent of simmering apples and spices. But beneath the surface of daily life, an unspoken question lingered between them. Would they ever see Shadow again? One particularly chilly evening, as the first frost clung to the edges of fallen leaves, Mary stood by the window, staring into the darkness. The porch light flickered softly, casting long shadows across the yard. She didn't expect to see anything. Maybe that's why her heart nearly stopped when she did. A small, familiar figure hovered near the edge of the woods, partially hidden in the undergrowth. "Shadow. John," she called, her voice a hushed mixture of surprise and excitement. John hurried over, squinting into the darkness. Sure enough, there he was, thinner than before, his ribs faintly visible beneath his fur, but unmistakably Shadow. His eyes glinted in the faint light, filled with something both wild and familiar. Without thinking, Mary grabbed a small bowl of mashed sweet potatoes, Shadow's favorite, and stepped onto the porch. She moved slowly, her heart pounding, whispering softly, "It's okay, little one. You're safe." Shadow didn't run. Instead, he watched her cautiously, his nose twitching at the scent of food. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he was close enough for Mary to place the bowl gently on the ground. She backed away, giving him space. John joined her, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. Together, they watched as Shadow crept forward, his movements cautious but driven by hunger. He sniffed the bowl, then began to eat. Small bites at first, as if unsure, then more eagerly. Mary's heart swelled with warmth. He was alive. He remembered them. Over the next few days, Shadow returned more frequently, each time venturing a little closer, his trust slowly rebuilding. He never stayed long, slipping back into the woods after each visit, but his presence was enough to fill the empty spaces he'd left behind. Then, one night, everything changed. A fierce storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds swallowing the sky, and the wind howled like a living thing. Rain battered the farmhouse windows, and thunder rumbled deep in the belly of the night. John and Mary huddled inside, the fire crackling in the hearth, their thoughts drifting to Shadow. Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "John," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "What if he's out there? What if he's in trouble?" John glanced at the storm outside, his brow furrowed. Logic told him Shadow was a wild animal, built to survive. But his heart, the part softened by days spent tending to that fragile creature, told a different story. Without another word, they both grabbed their coats and flashlights, stepping into the storm. The wind lashed at them, cold rain soaking through their clothes almost immediately. They called out softly, their voices swallowed by the roar of the storm. "Shadow!" Mary's voice was nearly lost in the wind, but she kept calling, her heart pounding with fear. Then a faint sound, a whimper, barely audible over the storm. John's flashlight swept across the trees, landing on a small figure tangled in the underbrush, struggling weakly. "Shadow!" They rushed to him, their hearts racing. His leg was caught in a hunter's snare, a cruel, rusted trap hidden beneath the fallen leaves. Shadow's eyes were wide with terror, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. John cursed under his breath, dropping to his knees beside the trap. His fingers worked quickly, his usual calm replaced by urgent desperation. Mary knelt beside him, whispering soothing words, her hands gently cradling Shadow's head, trying to calm him. After what felt like an eternity, the trap gave way with a metallic snap. John carefully freed Shadow's injured leg, his hands trembling slightly. Without hesitation, they wrapped Shadow in John's coat and carried him back through the storm, their hearts heavy with fear. Back at the farmhouse, they worked quickly. Mary cleaned the wound, tears blurring her vision, while John applied a makeshift splint, his jaw clenched with determination. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by Shadow's faint, pained whimpers. Finally, as dawn painted the sky with soft pink and gold hues, Shadow's breathing grew steadier. He was still alive, but fragile, so fragile. Mary collapsed into John's arms, her exhaustion spilling out in silent tears. "He came back to us," she whispered. John nodded, his voice rough with emotion. "And we'll save him. Again." The fragile thread that connected their hearts to Shadow hadn't broken. It had only stretched, tested by distance, fear, and wildness, but never broken. And now they were bound tighter than ever, between life and wildness. The days after the storm were a delicate balance between hope and fear. Shadow lay nestled in an old wicker basket near the fireplace, wrapped in layers of soft flannel. His breathing was shallow but steady, his injured leg carefully bandaged with strips of clean cloth. The snare had done more damage than John wanted to admit. Deep cuts, bruising, and signs of infection already setting in. Mary rarely left his side. She sat quietly, her hand resting gently on his fragile frame, feeling the faint rise and fall of his chest as if that connection could anchor him to life. Her heart ached with a mix of fear and guilt. What if they had found him too late? What if she hadn't listened to that instinct to search for him in the storm? John busied himself with practical tasks, fetching clean water, preparing poultices from herbs Mary had gathered over the years, and checking on the other animals with mechanical precision. But his eyes betrayed him. Every time he glanced at Shadow, a flicker of worry passed through his weathered face. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the farmhouse, Mary broke the silence. "John, what if he doesn't make it?" John didn't answer right away. He sat down beside her, his large, rough hands resting on his knees, staring at the flickering flames in the hearth. "We've done everything we can," he finally said, his voice low, filled with the weight of helplessness he rarely showed. "Now it's up to him." Mary nodded, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "But what if that's not enough?" John reached over, taking her hand in his. "Sometimes love's not about holding on. It's about being there, even when you can't change the outcome." His words settled over them like a soft blanket, offering comfort even in their brutal honesty. The night crept in slowly, and with it came a turning point. Shadow's breathing grew more labored, his small body trembling despite the warmth of the fire. Mary felt panic rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm, whispering soothing words, her fingers gently stroking his fur. John stood abruptly, his face set with determination. "I'm going to the barn." Mary looked up, confused. "Now? But I have an idea." Without another word, he disappeared into the cold night, leaving the door to creak shut behind him. Mary stayed with Shadow, her heart racing with a mix of fear and curiosity. John returned 15 minutes later, his arms full of hay, blankets, and, surprisingly, a small box filled with warm bottles. He set them carefully around Shadow, creating a cocoon of warmth. Body heat, he muttered, more to himself than to Mary. Sometimes that's all an animal needs to pull through. Mary watched him work, her heart swelling with both love and sorrow. John wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. He'd spent years tending to animals, mending fences, fixing what was broken. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about saving a piece of their hearts. They sat together through the night, trading shifts to rest their weary eyes. Mary hummed softly, an old lullaby her mother used to sing, while John kept the fire alive, feeding it logs with a quiet focus. As dawn approached, a faint change occurred. Shadow stirred. It was small, just the twitch of an ear, a slight shift of his body. But it was enough to make Mary gasp softly. "John," she whispered, her voice trembling with cautious hope. John rushed to her side, his breath catching as he saw it too. Shadow's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly blinking as if trying to understand where he was. His gaze met Mary's, and in that brief connection, something passed between them. Recognition, trust, and the faintest spark of life. Mary's tears came freely now, falling onto the soft blanket beneath her hands. "He's still with us," she whispered, her voice filled with fragile hope. John exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Yeah, he's still fighting." Over the next few days, Shadow's recovery was slow but steady. He began eating small pieces of fruit again, his appetite growing stronger with each passing meal. The infection faded, thanks to Mary's careful tending and John's herbal remedies. His injured leg remained stiff, but he started to put a little weight on it, his determination shining through in every shaky step. Despite the progress, Mary noticed something different. Shadow was restless. He often stared out the window, his dark eyes filled with a longing that tugged at her heart. "He misses the wild," John said one evening, noticing the same distant look in Shadow's gaze. Mary nodded slowly. "I know." It was a bittersweet realization. They had saved him twice now, but he wasn't meant to stay. His heart belonged to the woods, to the rustle of leaves and the cool breeze of open spaces. And soon they would have to let him go again. But this time they were ready, because love wasn't just about holding on. It was also about knowing when to set something free. The moment of truth. The weeks following Shadow's recovery passed in a blur of quiet mornings and warm afternoons. The seasons shifted, the autumn chill turning into the biting cold of early winter. Yet, inside the farmhouse, the air was filled with the comforting smells of freshly baked bread and the crackle of the fire as the winds howled outside. Shadow had grown stronger, his movements less tentative, though the faint limp still marked his every step. He was no longer the fragile, trembling creature they had found in the woods, but he was also not the wild, free animal he had once been. He was somewhere in between, a creature torn between two worlds. Mary and John both knew it. They didn't need to speak of it. The truth hung between them in the spaces where words weren't necessary. Shadow had become part of their family in ways neither of them expected. But as the days went by, Mary noticed that his gaze lingered more often on the door, his restless movements increasing. He had grown more comfortable in their home, yes, but there was an undeniable pull towards something outside, something beyond their small farm. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Mary found herself standing by the window, watching Shadow once again staring out into the distance. His body was still, his fur glistening in the dying light of day, but his eyes were filled with a yearning she knew too well. "John," she called softly, her voice catching in her throat. John, who had been outside feeding the animals, appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed as he took in her expression. "What is it?" "Shadow." She trailed off, her heart tight. "I think he's ready." John's jaw tightened as he walked over to her, standing beside her and gazing out at the small raccoon. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind and the soft creak of the old wooden house. They didn't speak, just watched. "I think so, too," John finally said, his voice rough. "He's not ours to keep, Mary. We've given him what we can." He has to go back to where he belongs. Mary swallowed hard. It wasn't just the thought of losing Shadow. It was the understanding that their love for him had never been about possession. It had been about giving him the chance to live, to survive, to be free. "We did the best we could," she whispered. John placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "We gave him more than most would. That's what matters." That evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, they made a decision. Mary and John spent the rest of the night preparing. They gathered the small supplies Shadow might need: a bit of food, a small blanket, and a pouch of the herbs that had helped him heal. They knew, deep down, that this wasn't a goodbye forever. He would remember them and they would remember him. But this was the moment where their paths would part. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, they bundled up, wrapped in layers of warmth, and went outside to find him. Shadow was in the yard, waiting, as if he knew the time had come. He didn't flinch when they approached, but his eyes were filled with that same mix of trust and longing. Mary crouched down in front of him, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the bundle of supplies gently before him. "Go on, little one," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're free now." Shadow stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes locking with hers. Then, slowly, he took a step backward, his body tense with indecision. He glanced over his shoulder toward the edge of the woods, then back at Mary and John, as though weighing his choices. Mary's heart ached with the quiet desperation of knowing this was the right thing to do, even if it hurt. Finally, Shadow took a few more steps back, then turned, his tail flicking once before he disappeared into the underbrush, his form swallowed up by the trees. Mary stood, her eyes never leaving the spot where he had been. John was silent beside her, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her steady. "I'll always remember him," she whispered. John kissed the top of her head. "So will I." The two of them stood there for a long time, watching the woods, waiting. There was no sound except the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a bird. Then, from the woods, came the unmistakable sound of a faint rustling, followed by the flicker of a small shadow darting through the trees. It was Shadow, back where he belonged, wild and free, living the life he was meant to live. Mary and John exchanged a quiet, tearful smile. They knew they had done the right thing, and for the first time in weeks they felt at peace. Their journey with Shadow had ended, but it had also transformed them in ways they couldn't yet fully understand. And just as life on the farm continued, so too did the silent promise that they would always be a part of Shadow's story. A new beginning. Winter settled in with a steady, cold embrace. The world outside was a landscape of frost and snow, a blanket of white that seemed to stretch on forever. The farmhouse, nestled in its little corner of the world, was a haven of warmth and light. Yet, despite the comfort of the hearth, Mary and John both felt the weight of absence, the quiet space left behind by Shadow. For a while, things seemed unchanged. They tended to the animals, fed the livestock, and continued with their usual routines. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the next, marked only by the turn of the seasons and the quiet passing of time. Life was slower, simpler, but in the silence, something important was missing. Mary often found herself staring out the window, watching the barren trees swaying in the wind. She missed the rustle of Shadow's movements at the edge of the farm, the way he had always come back to them when he needed care, his quiet presence like a shadow in the night. It was on one such evening, as the first real snowstorm of the season swept through the town, that the call came. John had just come in from the barn, his boots heavy with snow, when the phone rang, its shrill sound slicing through the stillness of the house. Mary answered it, a frown creasing her brow as she listened to the voice on the other end. "Mary? It's Tom, from the vet's office. I've got something here you might want to see." Her heart skipped a beat. Tom was one of the few people who knew about their connection with Shadow, the kind man who had helped them with his injuries. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with unease. "It's a raccoon, Mary. Injured and, well, it looks like the one you brought in. We've got him here at the clinic." Her breath caught in her chest. The same raccoon? Was it possible? "We're on our way," she said, before hanging up the phone. John was already pulling his coat on when she came into the hallway. "What's happened?" he asked, seeing the look on her face. "It's Shadow," Mary replied, her voice shaking slightly. "Tom says they found a raccoon that looks like him. We need to go to the clinic." Without another word, they bundled up and hurried out into the snow, the wind biting at their faces as they made their way to the small veterinary clinic just outside of town. The drive felt like it took forever, the snow swirling around them, the road barely visible under the heavy storm. John's grip on the wheel tightened, his eyes focused on the road as if willing the distance to shorten. When they finally arrived, Tom was waiting outside, his expression solemn. He led them inside, where the warmth of the building hit them like a wave, a stark contrast to the cold outside. "There he is," Tom said, pointing to a small cage in the corner of the room. Mary's heart dropped as she stepped closer. Shadow. It was him, but not. He was thinner than before, his fur matted and dirty, his eyes dull and unfocused. His once vibrant energy was gone, replaced by an almost haunting weariness. "Is he okay?" Mary whispered, her voice barely a breath. "He's been through a lot," Tom said softly. "We're doing everything we can. His leg's injured again, and he's malnourished. It's like he's been on his own for a while." John knelt down beside the cage, his hand reaching out to the bars. Shadow looked up at him, recognition flickering in his eyes, but the creature in front of him was no longer the same confident, wild raccoon they had once known. "We'll take him," Mary said, her voice firm. "We'll take care of him. He's been through so much." Tom nodded, his face softening with understanding. "We'll get him ready for you. He'll need rest, care. It won't be easy." "I don't care," Mary said, her voice steady now, despite the tremble in her hands. "We've given him a second chance before. We'll do it again." The next few days were a blur of careful tending and quiet worry. Shadow seemed to be slipping further into himself, his body weakened by the cold and the injury to his leg. He had clearly been through something terrifying, something that had stripped away the wild strength they had seen in him before. Mary and John kept a vigil over him, feeding him small amounts of food and helping him drink water. His body trembled at first, unwilling to trust them again, but slowly, he began to relax. It was during one of these quiet moments, as Mary sat beside him, gently stroking his fur, that she felt something change. His breathing steadied, his eyes closed, and for the first time since he had returned to them, there was peace in his face. He was still so small and fragile, but there was a flicker of the old Shadow in him. Something wild, something that refused to give in. "We'll help him," John said softly from the doorway, his voice thick with emotion. "He's stronger than we thought." Mary nodded, her heart swelling with hope. "He is." The days turned into weeks, and slowly Shadow began to recover. He wasn't the same wild creature he had once been, but he was no longer the broken animal they had found that night in the woods. His body healed, his energy returned, and he began to show signs of the strength he had once possessed. One afternoon, as the first thaw of spring began to melt the snow, Shadow looked up at the door. He hesitated, then took a step toward it, his eyes flicking back to Mary and John. It was a small step, but one that they both recognized. He was ready. Mary and John exchanged a glance. This time, there was no hesitation. "You've earned it, little one," Mary said softly. With a final glance at them, Shadow disappeared out the door, into the woods, his body strong and sure once more. They watched him go, knowing that it was time. It had always been time. Shadow had come back to them for a reason, and now he was finally free. As they stood in the doorway, watching the trees beyond, a sense of peace settled over them. They had given him everything they could, and in return, he had given them something precious, an understanding of what it meant to truly love. And as the spring sun warmed the earth, they knew their lives would never be the same. The wildness had always been a part of them, and now it was part of Shadow too. And that was enough. Full circle. Spring arrived gently like a promise kept. The trees, once bare, began to bud with fresh life, their branches adorned in soft shades of green. Flowers bloomed, dotting the landscape in a vibrant burst of color. The world outside seemed to breathe with renewal, a reflection of the change that had slowly taken place inside the farmhouse as well. Mary and John found themselves with new routines, the steady rhythm of life in the country going on without interruption. They tended to their animals, fixed broken fences, and made plans for the coming summer. But every now and then, their thoughts drifted back to Shadow. They never spoke of him aloud, not wanting to dwell on the loss, but they both felt it. An absence that was not entirely gone, yet no longer heavy. They had come to terms with it, knowing that the raccoon was out there wild and free, just as he was meant to be. He had made his choice and they had respected it. There was peace in that. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the farmland, John and Mary sat together on the porch, sipping their tea. The cool evening air smelled of earth and new grass, and the world seemed to pause for just a moment. "I thought we'd never see him again," Mary said quietly, her eyes fixed on the slowly darkening sky. "I know," John replied, his voice soft, "but we did what we had to. He needed to be free." There was a brief pause, and for a moment, the only sound was the chirping of crickets. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Mary caught movement. Something small and quick, darting at the edge of the yard. Her breath caught in her throat. "John," she whispered. He turned, following her gaze. For a split second, neither of them moved. Then, there it was, a flicker of familiar dark eyes. It was Shadow, standing at the edge of the garden, watching them with a cautious curiosity. His body was leaner now, his fur more vibrant than it had been in the winter. His eyes met Mary's, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. He was there, in the same place where he had first entered their lives, but he was different, stronger, more confident. Mary stood slowly, her heart beating faster. She didn't want to startle him, didn't want to make him feel like he was being trapped. She simply reached her hand out toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Shadow?" The raccoon hesitated for a moment, then took a cautious step forward, then another. Slowly, he made his way toward them, as if testing the waters, unsure of his place in this world that had given him so much, and yet so little. John stood up behind her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Is it really him?" Mary nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I think so." With each step, Shadow drew closer, his eyes never leaving them. When he finally reached the base of the steps, he stopped, sitting down with a quiet exhale, his tail flicking back and forth. For the first time in a long while, he seemed at peace. Mary knelt down slowly, just within his reach, but she didn't touch him. She didn't need to. This was not a moment of possession, but of shared understanding. She could see it in his eyes. He wasn't here for help, for care, or for safety. He was here because he had come full circle. Shadow had found his way back to them, not because he needed them, but because they had become a part of his journey, just as he had become a part of theirs. For several minutes, they sat together in silence. Mary, John, and Shadow, sharing the simple, quiet peace of the moment. No one spoke and no one needed to. This was a moment of completion, a moment where all the pain, the uncertainty, the struggle had led to this. A shared understanding that life was fragile, but beautiful. Finally, with a soft, almost unnoticeable flick of his tail, Shadow stood up and turned toward the forest once more. He paused, glancing back at them, and then, without a word, he disappeared into the trees. Mary and John stood together, watching as the raccoon faded into the distance. There was no sadness in the moment, no sense of loss. Instead, there was a deep, quiet joy in knowing that they had given him the one thing he truly needed, freedom. "That was him," Mary said softly, her voice full of quiet awe. John nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "Yes, it was." They stood there for a long time, as the last light of day disappeared behind the trees, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. And for the first time since Shadow had left them, they were at peace. They had given him the chance to live, and in return, he had given them something far greater. He had shown them the power of love, the importance of letting go, and the beauty of second chances. As the night settled in, with the stars twinkling high above, Mary and John sat in the quiet of their home, side by side, knowing that their lives would always be intertwined with that little raccoon who had changed everything. And in the distance, far beyond the edge of their farm, they knew Shadow was out there, living his life wild and free, just as he was meant to be. The end of one journey had marked the beginning of another, and for them that was enough.